For centuries, the image of queens has been wrapped in silk, jewels, and carefully painted portraits. They are often remembered as delicate figures in ballrooms or tragic characters in love stories, their crowns shining but their voices muted. Yet behind those polished images lies a very different truth. Many of these women were not passive symbols, but powerful players who challenged kings, defied expectations, and left legacies that still shape the world today. Think of a queen who led armies into battle, another who sparked a religious revolution, one who used her unmarried status to outwit foreign powers, and even a queen who dared to topple her own husband. Their stories read less like fairy tales and more like political thrillers, filled with ambition, betrayal, and strategy. What makes their lives so intriguing is not just the power they held, but the ways they were judged. A man could be ruthless and called strong, but a queen who showed the same strength was often branded dangerous or unnatural. Centuries later, those judgments still echo when women in leadership today are called too ambitious, too emotional, or too cold. To explore the truth about these queens is to uncover not just the hidden depths of their lives, but also the larger story of how power, gender, and history are intertwined. Their choices, their triumphs, and even their downfalls invite us to look again, to question the easy labels, and to see them as the complex and commanding figures they truly were. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we will journey through the lives of England's most unconventional queens, shattering myths and uncovering the real women who shaped nations, challenged norms, and left behind legacies far greater than the crowns they wore. When people hear the word queen, they often imagine a woman seated in a gilded chair, dressed in silks, her hands folded gently in her lap, while she remains silent in the presence of men who govern. This vision is not accidental. It has been shaped by centuries of art, storytelling, and traditional history writing. The queen has often been portrayed as delicate, demure, and confined to the court, as though her only purpose were to provide heirs, wear fine gowns, and stand as a decorative figure beside the king. Yet if one begins to look more carefully at the actual lives of England's queens, both consorts and regnant, the truth is far more complex. They were not fragile ornaments. Many of them maneuvered in the dangerous world of politics, used intelligence and ambition to secure survival, and on more than one occasion took bold actions that startled their contemporaries. To understand them only as background figures is to miss the human drama that shaped the monarchy and the country itself. Part of the reason for these enduring stereotypes lies in how history was written for centuries. Until quite recently, chroniclers, biographers, and school textbooks tended to focus on kings, wars, and parliaments. Queens often appeared only in the margins, included when they married, bore children, or occasionally served as pawns in diplomatic negotiations. When these writers did pause to describe them, they often relied on stock images: the obedient wife, the saintly mother, or the dangerous seductress who led men astray. Such images were easier to manage than the reality of strong-minded women who did not fit the mold. By flattening them into symbols rather than acknowledging them as actors, the record gave future generations the illusion that queens were less significant than the men who surrounded them. This approach did a disservice not only to the women themselves, but also to our understanding of the political and cultural life of England. Take, for example, Eleanor of Aquitaine. For a long time she was described in simple terms, often as a dangerously independent duchess who married two kings and caused trouble by her willfulness. The deeper truth, revealed through careful study, shows a woman of extraordinary skill who ruled vast lands in her own right, rode on crusade, and managed to maintain her authority through decades of turmoil. Far from being confined to a courtly chamber, Eleanor was on horseback, commanding retinues, arranging alliances, and shaping the fate of her children, many of whom would become powerful rulers in their own time. Her reputation for scandal may have fascinated medieval chroniclers, but it also obscured the fact that she was a political figure who understood strategy as well as any prince. Catherine of Aragon provides another striking case. Too often she is remembered only as the first wife set aside by Henry VIII, the woman who could not produce a surviving male heir and whose refusal to step aside conveniently allowed the king to pursue and bully. Yet this narrow story hides her years of power. While Henry was campaigning in France, Catherine served as regent in England. When the Scots invaded in his absence, she organized the defense and even sent him a piece of the fallen Scottish king's bloody coat as proof of victory. It is hard to imagine a more direct refutation of the idea that queens were passive figures. She may have lost her crown in the end, but while she wore it, she showed resolve, courage, and administrative skill. And Boleyn herself, though often reduced to the role of seductress, deserves a more nuanced place in history. She was not a silent court lady who happened to catch the king's eye. She was educated, politically aware, and keenly involved in the religious debates of her age. Her encouragement of reform, her correspondence with scholars, and her influence on Henry's break from Rome show that she was a participant in shaping the English Reformation. To dismiss her as a mere object of desire ignores the intellectual and spiritual dimensions of her story. Her rise and fall may read like a tragic romance, but underneath it lies a history of ambition, conviction, and political maneuvering. Mary Tudor, often remembered as Bloody Mary, is another figure who has suffered from simplification. The image of a cruel fanatic who burned Protestants at the stake has long overshadowed her struggle to secure legitimacy in a world that doubted the capacity of a woman to rule. She was the first woman to wear the English crown in her own right. Her reign was short, and her policies met resistance, but to view her only through the lens of violence erases the challenge she faced in asserting authority against men who believed the throne was not a place for a queen regnant. Her attempt to restore Catholic faith, though harsh in execution, was part of a larger struggle about identity and power in England. She showed that a woman could sit on the throne not as a consort, but as sovereign, a precedent that would shape her half-sisters. Elizabeth I, of course, stands as the great exception in popular memory. She is usually presented as the strong, intelligent, and commanding queen who brought England into a golden age. While she certainly shattered stereotypes by ruling for decades with skill, she is also proof that history can exaggerate in the other direction. The image of Elizabeth as the Virgin Queen, married only to her country, risks turning her into another symbol rather than a human being with flaws, fears, and contradictions. She was not a flawless icon, but a ruler who made compromises, faced failures, and navigated the treacherous waters of succession and diplomacy. To treat her only as the triumphant exception misses the wider truth that other queens also demonstrated resilience and vision, even if they lacked the same longevity or favorable chroniclers. The flattening of queens into simplistic roles reflects the broader challenge of how we remember women in history. When textbooks describe them only in terms of marriage alliances, fertility, or scandal, they strip away the complexity that makes them real. These women were often trained in politics from an early age, aware that their marriages and actions could alter the balance of power between nations. They learned languages, studied theology, and mastered court etiquette not as idle accomplishments, but as tools for survival. A queen who could not hold her ground risked being set aside, exiled, or even executed. The stakes were life and death, not just personal comfort. To imagine them as passive misses the constant pressure under which they lived. One of the enduring problems is that the symbols attached to queens are so powerful. The ball gown, the crown, the image of a woman curtsying or smiling sweetly from a balcony. These visuals linger in the public imagination. They suggest luxury and fragility. Yet beneath the jewels were individuals who negotiated treaties, managed estates, arranged marriages, and dealt with the fallout of rebellion and war. Many of them were educated to a level that would rival the finest male scholars of their age. Their contributions, however, were often dismissed as the work of advisors or attributed to the influence of men. Only by peeling away the layers of stereotype can we see how much agency they truly possessed. The idea of the queen as merely ornamental also ignores the emotional labor these women carried. They were expected to maintain households, set standards of behavior at court, and model ideals for the realm. When they failed to produce children, or when tragedy struck, the blame fell heavily on their shoulders. Miscarriages, infant deaths, and political disappointments became public matters, dissected by gossip and propaganda. Their bodies were not their own, but seen as vessels for dynasties. Yet many of them endured these pressures with courage, refusing to surrender dignity even when under siege from rumor or political assault. The resilience shown in such moments is as important as their more dramatic acts on the stage of politics. There is also the question of how queens were remembered by those who came after. Chroniclers loyal to one faction or religion painted them as saints or sinners, depending on convenience. Plays, poems, and later novels added layers of myth, often more entertaining than accurate. By the time these stories reached the classroom, they had hardened into simple narratives. Eleanor the Rebel, Catherine the Wronged, and the Temptress, Mary the Fanatic, Elizabeth the Glorious, Such portraits are easy to recall but fail to capture the rich variety of their lives. The challenge for modern readers is to resist these neat labels and to embrace the messy, contradictory humanity behind them. When we begin to do so, a fuller picture of England's monarchy emerges. The queens were not just background figures in a story led by men. They were active participants, sometimes restrained, sometimes bold, but always significant. Their actions could alter alliances, inspire loyalty, or provoke rebellion. They left marks not only on the politics of their time, but also on the cultural and religious life of the nation. To reduce them to ball gowns and silken slippers is to miss the harder truth. Power in the royal court was often shared, contested, and shaped by women whose presence could not be ignored. Understanding this complexity also changes how we think about stereotypes of femininity. The image of the queen as delicate and demure reflects wider expectations that women in general should remain quiet and submissive. By challenging this image, we see that even within the most restrictive structures of monarchy, women found ways to assert themselves. Some did so openly, by commanding armies or ruling as sovereigns. Others acted behind the scenes, shaping policies through counsel, persuasion, and patronage. Their methods differed, but their impact was real. To ignore them is to ignore the half of history that has too often been hidden. The phrase, "beyond the ball gown," reminds us to look past appearances. The gowns, jewels, and ceremonies were real, of course, and they mattered in terms of symbolism. But they were only one part of the story. Beneath the glitter lay the constant tension of survival in a dangerous world. Queens lived with the threat of disease, childbirth complications, betrayal, and political downfall. They endured exile, imprisonment, and even execution. Their courage lay not only in moments of grandeur, but also in the endurance of daily uncertainty. To recognize this is to see them as human beings, not distant icons. As we peel back the myths, we also learn something broader about history itself. The way stories are told matters. If we allow stereotypes to dominate, we inherit a shallow understanding of the past. If we take the time to explore the hidden depths, we discover a richer, more varied, and more honest account. The queens of England were not identical. Each lived in her own circumstances, with her own strengths and flaws. But together they reveal that the monarchy was never a purely male institution. It was a stage on which women acted with determination, sometimes quietly, sometimes with dramatic force, always leaving traces that deserve recognition. By shattering the image of queens as delicate and demure, we do more than correct the record. We also open space to understand how women, across time, have negotiated power in societies that sought to limit them. The story of England's queens is not only about crowns and courts. It is about resilience, intelligence, and the refusal to be confined by stereotypes. When we read them in full, not as flattened figures but as complex individuals, we not only honor their lives, but also enrich our understanding of the past. When we turn to the story of Matilda of England, sometimes called Empress Matilda, the neat illusions of a quiet, obedient queen collapse entirely. She was not merely a consort, nor did she fit the mold of a courtly lady defined by husband or children. She was a claimant to the throne of England in her own right, and she was willing to fight for it. The daughter of Henry I, she was named his heir after the tragic death of her brother William in the White Ship disaster. Henry compelled his nobles to swear loyalty to her as successor, a decision almost unheard of at the time, for a woman ruling as sovereign challenged centuries of expectation. Yet when Henry died, many of those same nobles broke their oaths, rallying instead behind Stephen of Blois. What followed was a bitter civil war remembered as the Anarchy, lasting nearly 2 decades. Matilda's role in this struggle is a vivid example of how women could wield authority in ways that startled their contemporaries. She was not a silent figure in the background, but the very heart of the conflict. She commanded loyalty from powerful lords, raised armies, and endured long campaigns in hostile territory. Chroniclers, unsettled by her resolve, often painted her as arrogant, masculine, or overbearing. They struggled to describe a woman who demanded to be obeyed like a king. Yet those same qualities of confidence and firmness were praised when shown by her male rivals. The double standard is clear. What was considered leadership in men became a flaw in her. Still, she persisted. One of the most dramatic moments of her campaign came when she was besieged in Oxford in the dead of winter. Surrounded and cut off, her defeat seemed inevitable. But in the dark of night, dressed in white cloaks that blended into the snow, She and a small band of loyal followers slipped silently out of the castle, crossing the frozen river and escaping the encirclement. This daring flight showed not only courage, but also strategic cunning. Such actions remind us that queens and claimants like Matilda were not fragile ornaments of the court. They were actors in the raw contest of power, willing to risk their lives for the crown. Although Matilda never wore the crown in a coronation, her claim did not vanish. Through her persistence, she secured recognition for her son, Henry, who would become Henry II, the founder of the Plantagenet dynasty. In this way, her determination shaped the future of England as profoundly as any crowned ruler. Her story reveals that the power of queens and female claimants was not only in symbolic presence, but also in their ability to fight, negotiate, and lay the foundations for dynasties. The case of Matilda also shows the limitations of the stereotypes that reduced royal women to passive figures. Here was a woman commanding knights, making alliances, and standing on battlefields. Yet many traditional histories treated her as an oddity, an exception that proved the rule. In truth, she was part of a broader pattern. Across centuries, royal women in England and beyond stepped into the arena of politics and war when circumstances demanded it. To view Matilda as unusual is to underestimate the resilience and ambition that many queens displayed. The image of women like Matilda complicates our view of medieval gender roles. While society expected women to obey, circumstances often forced them into positions of command. The throne was too valuable a prize to ignore, and when dynastic survival was at stake, a woman's claim could not simply be brushed aside. What mattered was whether she had the will and the support to pursue it. Matilda had both. Her rivals might have tried to use her gender as a weapon against her, but she wielded her lineage and her legitimacy as weapons of her own. In doing so, she left a legacy that stretched beyond her own failed coronation, embedding female authority into the dynastic bloodline that followed. This blending of rebellion and regality continued in later centuries, as queens navigated their roles in times of conflict. Consider Isabella of France, remembered by many as the she-wolf of France. Married to Edward II, she grew frustrated with his reliance on favorites and his failure to govern effectively. Instead of accepting a passive role, she allied herself with discontented nobles and even partnered with Roger Mortimer to lead an invasion of England. In a remarkable reversal, she dethroned her own husband and placed her young son, Edward III, on the throne. Though later remembered with suspicion and accusations of cruelty, Isabella had demonstrated political daring that rivaled any baron or king. Such examples underline a consistent theme. When queens or royal women stepped beyond the confines of expectation, contemporaries often labeled them as unnatural. Chroniclers used words like wolfish, haughty, or unwomanly. Yet when men acted with ambition, they were admired as bold or decisive. This bias shaped the way history was recorded, leaving later generations with distorted portraits. To peel back those distortions is to rediscover the truth. These women were not anomalies, but participants in the game of power, bound by the same stakes and risks as their male counterparts. In the Tudor period, the stage grew even larger for such political power plays. Mary Tudor's reign, though marred in memory by the persecutions of Protestants, was also marked by her ability to rally supporters to her cause at a moment when rivals tried to deny her claim. When Edward VI died and Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed queen, Mary did not retreat. She gathered her allies, raised forces, and marched with determination until London recognized her as sovereign. In that moment, she proved that a woman could not only claim, but seize the throne through decisive action. The fact that her reign is remembered mainly for its cruelties does not erase the courage she showed in securing her crown against formidable opposition. Elizabeth I, often remembered in heroic terms, also understood that power required careful performance. Her speeches to the troops at Tilbury or her deft balancing of suitors across Europe show that she used her gender both as a challenge and as a tool. She reminded her subjects that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, a phrase that acknowledged stereotype while simultaneously overturning it. By controlling her image, Elizabeth demonstrated the political acumen required to rule for more than 40 years. She mastered the performance of monarchy, but behind the performance was a relentless attention to detail, an ability to read character, and a talent for survival. Beyond the Tudors, later queens consorts such as Henrietta Maria in the 17th century found themselves embroiled in conflict as well. As wife of Charles I, she was accused of manipulating her husband, influencing him toward Catholic sympathies and stirring up divisions that would explode in civil war. Whether or not these accusations were fair, they reveal how dangerous and politically charged the role of a queen could be. She was not seen as neutral, but as a force with the potential to sway the fate of a kingdom. Her resilience during exile, fundraising efforts abroad, and attempts to rally support for her husband's cause underscore that queens were not mere spectators in times of crisis. In the 19th century, Queen Victoria offers yet another perspective. Unlike Matilda, she did not ride into battle, but she shaped the monarchy through her long reign and her determination to assert moral authority. She resisted being overshadowed by ministers or by her husband, Prince Albert. Her journals reveal a woman deeply engaged in political discussion, keenly aware of the optics of monarchy and unafraid to assert her opinions. Though her reign is often remembered for domesticity and empire, it was also marked by a queen who understood her role as political, symbolic, and deeply influential. When we trace this line from Matilda through Isabella, Mary, Elizabeth, Henrietta Maria, and Victoria, a pattern emerges that breaks apart the stereotype of queens as passive, delicate figures. They were rebels in regal robes, women who used their position to shape history in ways both subtle and dramatic. Their actions were not confined to the private sphere, but spilled openly into public life, altering the course of wars, dynasties, and nations. It is important to remember that their power was never secure. Unlike kings, whose authority was usually assumed, queens often had to prove themselves twice over, once by lineage and once by action. They faced skepticism, criticism, and resistance from a society reluctant to accept female rule. Yet again and again, they showed that determination, intelligence, and courage could overcome these barriers. They claimed space in the male-dominated world of politics not as quiet companions, but as players with their own stakes. By examining their lives more fully, we also learn something about the structures of history itself. The way we tell stories shapes what we believe about possibility. If we accept only the flattened images of queens as decorative or demure, we perpetuate a narrow view of both women and monarchy. If we embrace the fuller stories, we see that power has always been more complex, more contested, and more inclusive than stereotypes suggest. The truth is that queens, claimants, and consorts of England lived lives filled with contradiction. They wore the jewels and gowns, yes, but they also donned armor, wrote letters of command, negotiated with rebels, and endured sieges. They bore children, but they also bore the burdens of diplomacy and the expectations of dynasties. They could be both nurturing and ruthless, both symbols of peace and instruments of war. To flatten them into one role is to miss the reality that they were human beings, as complex and contradictory as any king. In seeing them this way, we shatter the old stereotypes and gain a richer understanding of history. The ball gown is not enough to define a queen, nor is the crown itself. What defines them is their ability to navigate the treacherous waters of power, to rebel when necessary, and to wield their position with whatever tools they had at hand. In their stories, we find not just the history of monarchy, but the broader history of how women have fought to assert themselves in worlds that sought to silence them. Eleanor of Aquitaine is perhaps one of the most striking examples of a queen whose life defies every easy stereotype. To call her simply a queen consort is to overlook the breadth of her authority and the audacity with which she moved through the political landscapes of 12th century Europe. Born the heir to the vast Duchy of Aquitaine, she commanded not just a title but immense lands stretching across what is now southwestern France. In an age when territory equaled power, she began her adult life already one of the most sought-after women in Europe. Her inheritance alone gave her more leverage than most kings of her time, and from the moment she entered the political stage, she displayed a will to shape her destiny rather than be shaped by it. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France revealed just how unsuited she was to the passive role expected of a consort. Intelligent, outspoken, and accustomed to the lively culture of her native Aquitaine, she found the rigid piety of the French court stifling. Yet even within that restricted world, she made her presence felt. She traveled with Louis on the Second Crusade, an extraordinary act for a queen, and though chroniclers criticized her behavior, their outrage underscores just how unusual it was to see a woman moving in the realm of warriors and strategy. They accused her of distracting men, of overstepping her role, of acting with a freedom they considered unfeminine. But beneath their scorn lies the reality that Eleanor was not content to sit quietly while others decided the fate of kingdoms. She engaged, argued, and participated in the very heart of political and military enterprise. The annulment of her marriage to Louis might have ended the career of another woman, but for Eleanor it was only the beginning. Within weeks, she made a bold choice that would alter the course of European politics for decades. She married Henry of Anjou, a man 11 years her junior, who within 2 years would become Henry II of England. With this union, she brought her vast Aquitaine inheritance into the Plantagenet fold, creating an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. Few political moves in medieval Europe were more consequential, and it was Eleanor's will and calculation that made it possible. She was not a pawn traded between men, but an active negotiator of her own power. Her role as Queen Consort of England was far from ornamental. Eleanor governed her Duchy of Aquitaine independently, issuing charters, administering justice, and presiding over courts renowned for their culture and influence. She was not simply a decorative presence in English palaces, but a ruler in her own right, maintaining authority over her lands even while tied to the English crown. Her court became famous for fostering poetry, music, and the ideals of chivalry, giving her a reputation not only as a political figure, but also as a cultural patron whose influence stretched beyond politics into the very imagination of the medieval West. Yet her story is not one of quiet patronage alone. Eleanor repeatedly placed herself at the center of high-stakes power struggles. She quarreled with Henry over his infidelities and his governance, but more importantly, she aligned herself with her sons when they rebelled against him. It is hard to imagine a clearer rejection of the image of the loyal, submissive queen than Eleanor leading opposition against her own husband, the King of England. The rebellion failed, and she was imprisoned for over a decade, but even captivity could not erase her importance. When Henry died and her son Richard became king, she re-emerged as one of the most trusted and capable figures in the realm. During Richard's reign, Eleanor acted with authority that exceeded many male nobles. She secured his succession, organized his marriage, and even managed affairs while he was away on crusade. When he was captured and held for ransom, it was Eleanor, already in her 70s, who undertook the immense effort of raising the funds and negotiating his release. Her energy and determination in old age were as remarkable as her boldness in youth. She was not a relic of a bygone era, but a driving force in the politics of her time, shaping the destinies of her children and the course of 2 kingdoms. When Richard died, Eleanor continued her tireless involvement, supporting her youngest son John as king. She traveled across her vast territories, defending them against threats and securing loyalty in a way no one else could. Her longevity gave her an unmatched authority. She had lived through the reigns of 2 kings as consort and 3 of her own sons as monarchs, and she remained active almost to her final days. Few rulers, male or female, had such sustained influence over the politics of Europe. What makes Eleanor's story especially important in breaking stereotypes is the range of her roles. She was Duchess in her own right, Queen Consort of France, Queen Consort of England, regent, diplomat, cultural patron, and matriarch of a dynasty. She defied the notion that queens were confined to ceremonial functions. She managed land, inspired rebellion, secured ransoms, and oversaw governments. Yet, like other powerful women, she was often caricatured by chroniclers as headstrong or dangerous, as though her authority was a threat to the natural order. The truth is that she was a ruler with vision and resilience, whose gender did not diminish her capacity to act decisively. Placing Eleanor alongside Matilda of England, Isabella of France, and the Tudor queens reveals a consistent thread. Royal women, far from being passive, often acted as key players in shaping political landscapes. The stereotype of delicacy collapses when faced with Eleanor raising armies, riding across Europe in her 70s, or negotiating with emperors for the release of her son. Her story demonstrates that queenship could be as much about strategy and survival as kingship itself. Moreover, Eleanor's influence extended beyond her lifetime. The Plantagenet dynasty she helped secure ruled England for over 3 centuries, and her descendants included monarchs who left indelible marks on history. Her bloodline stretched through Europe, earning her the nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. But her legacy is not only biological. She set an example of how queens could wield power, an example that reverberated long after her death. The way she has been remembered also reveals the shifting attitudes toward female authority. In some accounts, she is romanticized as the beautiful, cultured queen of courtly love, a figure of poetry more than politics. In others, she is vilified as a meddler, a woman who dared to rebel against her husband and thus disturbed the peace of the realm. Only more recently have historians begun to recognize the full scope of her achievements, acknowledging her as a political actor whose decisions shaped kingdoms. This evolution in her reputation mirrors the broader struggle to see queens not as mere accessories, but as individuals whose agency mattered. In the flow of history, Eleanor's life bridges the medieval and the modern. She showed that a woman could rule vast lands, influence international politics, and survive the shifting fortunes of war and family conflict. She endured imprisonment, rebellion, and loss, yet she continued to act with determination. To reduce her to a consort is to erase the extraordinary breadth of her experience. To see her as she was is to understand that queenship was never as simple as the stereotypes suggest. Her story also invites us to think more deeply about power itself. Power is not always visible in swords or crowns. Sometimes it lies in negotiation, in endurance, in the ability to maintain loyalty across decades. Eleanor wielded every form of power available to her, from land and lineage to cultural influence and sheer personal presence. That she managed to do so in a world resistant to female rule is a testament to her resilience. By examining Eleanor alongside other queens, we see that the history of monarchy is not a story of men alone. It is a shared story, shaped by women who refused to be confined by expectations. Their gowns and crowns may have suggested fragility, but beneath them lay wills of steel and minds attuned to survival. In their stories, we find rebellion not as a departure from queenship, but as a core part of it. They were rebels in regal robes, shaping their worlds as much as any king, and Eleanor of Aquitaine stands as one of the brightest lights among them. Elizabeth I occupies a singular place in the long line of English queens, and her reign illustrates, perhaps more vividly than any other, how a woman could transform limitations into weapons of authority. She is remembered as the Virgin Queen, a title that may appear to confine her identity to her unmarried state, but in truth she used that image as one of the most brilliant political strategies of her time. Where her sister Mary had married Philip of Spain and faced suspicion that England might be absorbed into a foreign power, Elizabeth chose to remain unwed, presenting herself as a bride to her kingdom and to her people. This was not an act of passivity, but a deliberate calculation. By keeping her hand unclaimed, she denied any nobleman, foreign prince, or ambitious courtier the chance to rule beside her, and she maintained complete independence in her decisions. Her reign did not begin in security. When she ascended the throne in the year 1558, she was a young woman of 25, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Her legitimacy had been questioned for most of her life, for her father had declared her illegitimate after Anne's execution, and though later statutes restored her to the succession, doubt always clung to her name. She inherited a realm divided by religion, exhausted by war, and suspicious of female rule after the turbulent reign of her half-sister Mary. Yet Elizabeth understood that appearances could be as powerful as armies. From her earliest days as queen, she cultivated the image of a sovereign who embodied both strength and grace, a woman who might acknowledge the weakness of her sex in words, but in practice outshone her male contemporaries in resilience and cunning. The matter of marriage haunted her reign from its beginning. Parliament, courtiers, and foreign ambassadors pressed her to take a husband. They argued that the security of the dynasty required it, that the country needed a male heir, that the stability of the realm could not rest on a single woman's shoulders. Yet Elizabeth evaded every proposal. She entertained suitors with just enough encouragement to keep alliances alive, but never allowed herself to be trapped. She dangled the possibility of marriage to the Duke of Anjou, to Archduke Charles, to King Philip of Spain, and even entertained domestic candidates like Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. Each time, she maneuvered with care, extracting diplomatic concessions or holding enemies at bay, but always withdrawing before the final commitment. This careful dance with marriage became one of her sharpest political tools. By remaining single, she was not weakened but strengthened. She could promise herself to France one day, to Spain the next, to a powerful English noble the day after, and in doing so she ensured that all parties continued to court her favor. Her unmarried state became not a flaw but a shield, allowing her to project herself as the embodiment of England itself. To marry would have meant dividing that identity, granting influence to another. By staying single, she declared symbolically that she was wedded to her country. The image of the Virgin Queen was also bound up with religious politics. In a nation torn between Catholic and Protestant loyalties, Elizabeth presented herself as a figure above faction, devoted to the stability of the Church of England. By refusing a husband, she avoided the suspicion that she might place her loyalties with a foreign Catholic power or with an ambitious Protestant lord. Her virginity became a metaphor for purity of rule, an emblem of unity in a time when division threatened to tear the kingdom apart. Elizabeth's skill and performance cannot be overstated. She understood the power of ceremony, of words, of symbols. She delivered speeches that stirred loyalty, famously telling her troops at Tilbury during the threat of Spanish invasion that though she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, she had the heart and stomach of a king. These words, echoing across the centuries, capture her genius for acknowledging stereotype while simultaneously subverting it. She admitted the weakness expected of her sex only to demolish it in the same breath. She turned the expectations against themselves, creating a paradox that magnified her strength. Her reign was not without peril. Rebellions broke out, Catholic plots threatened her life, and rival claimants like Mary Queen of Scots haunted her throne. Yet Elizabeth navigated these dangers with a mixture of caution and ruthlessness. She delayed decisions when delay served her, keeping opponents uncertain. But when action was required, she acted decisively, as in the eventual execution of Mary, a choice that weighed heavily on her but secured her realm against the constant threat of Catholic insurrection supported by Spain. Her ability to wait, to calculate, and then to strike when the moment was right marked her as a master strategist. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 stands as the most celebrated triumph of her reign. Though the victory owed much to weather and to the skill of her admirals, Elizabeth's leadership gave it symbolic power. She became the living embodiment of national resistance, the Virgin Queen protecting her people from foreign domination. The image of her riding out to speak to her troops, clad in armor, reinforced the idea that she was not merely a woman, but a sovereign whose body represented the strength of the kingdom. In that moment, she transformed the very notion of queenship, proving that a queen could inspire martial loyalty as effectively as any king. Elizabeth also mastered the politics of image through portraiture and art. She carefully controlled the way she was depicted, ensuring that paintings showed her as youthful, radiant, and majestic, even into her later years. Symbols of virginity, purity, and eternal strength surrounded her in these portraits: the moon, the sun, the ermine, the globe. She became almost mythological, a living icon whose body was fused with the destiny of England. This was not vanity but politics. She understood that in a time before mass media, images carried immense weight, and she crafted hers with meticulous care. Yet to focus only on her image risks underestimating her actual governance. Elizabeth was deeply involved in the workings of her state. She managed her finances with caution, often frustrating her ministers by refusing to overspend on wars or extravagances. She kept a close eye on her counselors, balancing their rivalries to ensure no single man dominated her government. She read reports, considered petitions, and made decisions with an attention to detail that belies the stereotype of queens as decorative. Her rule was active, deliberate, and pragmatic. Her relationship with her counselors reveals another dimension of her power. Men like William Cecil, Francis Walsingham, and Robert Dudley served her faithfully, but she never allowed herself to be ruled by them. She demanded loyalty and obedience, but she also played them against one another, ensuring that her authority remained supreme. They might advise, but she decided. She understood that as a woman she would be doubted, and so she sharpened her authority with constant vigilance. She listened, but she remained in control. Her reign was also marked by expansion overseas, laying the early groundwork for what would become the English Empire. Explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh carried her banner across the seas, challenging Spanish power and planting the seeds of English colonial ambition. Elizabeth herself was cautious about these ventures, wary of the costs, but she allowed them to proceed, recognizing the potential for wealth and prestige. In this way, she extended England's reach beyond Europe, aligning her monarchy with the beginnings of global power. The Virgin Queen image, however, came with personal costs. Elizabeth sacrificed the chance for family, for the intimacy of marriage, for the security of heirs. She lived surrounded by courtiers but ultimately alone, her closest attachments shadowed by the demands of politics. She faced the loneliness of old age without children, aware that her death would bring the end of the Tudor line. Yet she bore this burden as part of her larger choice, embracing her solitary state as the price of sovereignty. In this sacrifice lies part of her greatness, for she understood that her personal happiness could not outweigh the needs of her crown. Her final years were marked by decline and sorrow. The deaths of loyal counselors, the execution of her beloved favorite the Earl of Essex, and the weight of age pressed upon her. Yet even as her body weakened, her authority endured. She died in 1603, leaving the throne to James of Scotland, and with her ended the Tudor dynasty. But her reign left an indelible mark on England, remembered as a golden age of stability, culture, and national pride. Elizabeth's use of her unmarried state as a political tool shows how a supposed weakness could be turned into strength. Where others saw vulnerability, she found independence. By remaining single, she denied foreign influence, kept courtiers in suspense, and crafted an image that fused her body with the body of the nation. She showed that queenship could be more than a ceremonial role. It could be the center of power itself. Her example also reveals the deeper truth about the stereotypes of queens. The image of delicacy, of dependency, collapses when we see Elizabeth wielding her virginity as a weapon, her gender as a performance, and her solitude as sovereignty. She was not passive but active, not ornamental but essential. Her reign demonstrates that queens could be as calculating, as ambitious, and as commanding as any king, and that their strategies, though sometimes different in form, were equally effective in securing power. Placed within the wider history of England's queens, Elizabeth stands as both culmination and inspiration. She inherited the struggles of her predecessors, Matilda's claim, Eleanor's authority, Isabella's rebellion, Mary's contested reign, and transformed them into a vision of queenship that was both powerful and enduring. She proved that a woman could not only rule but rule with mastery, holding her country together in times of danger and guiding it toward a new era. In Elizabeth's story, we find the clearest refutation of the old stereotype. Queens were not delicate ornaments confined to the court. They were rulers, rebels, and strategists, shaping the destinies of nations. The virgin queen may have lived alone, but in her solitude she carried the weight of a kingdom, and in her reign she shattered forever the illusion that power belonged only to men. Isabella of France, remembered most often by the lurid nickname of the she-wolf, embodies in dramatic form the way queens could move beyond the boundaries set for them, transforming what seemed like private grievances into seismic political events. Married to Edward II of England, she entered a union that was meant to strengthen ties between two powerful realms. At first, her role was much like that of any medieval queen consort: to provide heirs, to serve as a symbol of alliance, and to act as a dignified presence at her husband's court. But the reality of her marriage was anything but dignified. Edward's notorious devotion to his male favorites, especially Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser the Younger, left Isabella sidelined, humiliated, and dangerously isolated. What followed was a story of betrayal, resilience, and bold rebellion, a tale that complicates every easy assumption about the passivity of queens. From her arrival in England as a young bride, Isabella confronted the difficulties of a king whose heart and attention were elsewhere. Edward's open favoritism toward Gaveston alienated many nobles, and it placed Isabella in a precarious position. Queens were expected to be mediators between the king and his subjects, bridges between families and sources of stability. But when the king flaunted his attachments and diminished his wife's influence, Isabella's ability to play that role was undermined. Chroniclers of the time describe her as patient and composed in her youth, enduring slights with outward grace. Yet beneath the surface, she was learning how fragile her position could be and how necessary it was to cultivate allies. The situation grew even more volatile after Gaveston's death, when Edward shifted his attachment to Hugh Despenser. Despenser and his family not only monopolized the king's affection, but also seized lands and wealth, enriching themselves at the expense of the nobility. Isabella found herself caught between an overbearing favorite and a husband who seemed determined to ignore her dignity. Her attempts to plead for fairness often met with contempt, and tensions mounted as she watched the realm fracture around the greed of Despenser and the king's stubbornness. It was in this crucible of frustration that Isabella's resilience began to harden into determination. She could have remained a neglected consort, nursing her injuries in silence, but instead she chose a more daring path. When Edward sent her on a diplomatic mission to France in the early 1420s, she seized the opportunity to turn her exile into strategy. There she formed an alliance with Roger Mortimer, a a powerful nobleman who had escaped imprisonment in England and harbored his own grievances against Edward and Despenser. Their partnership was both political and, as most accounts suggest, personal. In Mortimer, Isabella found not only a co-conspirator, but also a companion who recognized her ambition and her will. The scandal of her relationship with Mortimer cannot be separated from her political maneuvering. Chroniclers seized upon it, branding her with infamy, portraying her as adulterous, unnatural, and wolf-like in her hunger for power. Yet to focus only on scandal is to miss the deeper reality. Isabella and Mortimer together forged a plan that would topple one of the most disastrous reigns in English history. With support from disaffected nobles and from her French relatives, Isabella gathered forces and invaded England in 1326. Unlike many foreign invasions, hers met little resistance, for Edward and Despenser had alienated nearly everyone of consequence. Towns opened their gates, nobles flocked to her banner, and the once mighty king found himself abandoned. The fall of Edward II was as swift as it was dramatic. Hugh Despenser was captured, executed with brutality, and paraded as the symbol of corruption. Edward himself was forced to abdicate in favor of his son, the young Edward III. Isabella and Mortimer became the effective rulers of England, with the Queen Mother at the heart of governance. For the first time in centuries, a woman stood at the head of English power, not merely as a regent for a child, but as a dominant political figure, commanding armies and councils alike. Her triumph, however, came at a cost. To her contemporaries, the spectacle of a queen deposing her husband was shocking, almost unthinkable. The ideals of medieval kingship rested on divine authority and patriarchal order, and Isabella had shattered both by placing her son on the throne while casting her husband aside. Chroniclers struggled to interpret her actions. Some praised her for saving the realm from misrule, but many more painted her as a monstrous wife who betrayed her marriage vows and transgressed the natural order. The epithet she-wolf grew out of this atmosphere of suspicion, a name meant to strip her of femininity and mark her as predatory. Yet the story of Isabella does not end with triumph. Her partnership with Mortimer soon provoked the same resentments that had doomed Despenser. Mortimer enriched himself, dominated the young king, and made enemies of powerful lords. Isabella, now in her early 30s, found herself once again entangled with a man whose ambition overshadowed her own. The court whispered that she was ruled by her lover, that she had replaced one tyrant with another. By 1330, her son Edward III had come of age, and with a group of loyal nobles, he seized Mortimer in a daring coup. Mortimer was executed, and Isabella was placed under honorable house arrest, her influence sharply curtailed. For the rest of her life, Isabella lived in relative quiet, released from confinement after several years, but never restored to her former power. She retired to her estates, living comfortably and even regally, but without political authority. Her death in 1358 closed the chapter of a life that had stretched from the grandeur of French princess to the scandal of she-wolf and finally to the calm of semi-retirement. The arc of Isabella's life reveals both the potential and the peril of queens who dared to act. She wielded her marriage, her alliances, and her cunning to overthrow a king, proving that queenship could be a force capable of remaking the kingdom. Yet she also bore the brunt of the moral outrage that such actions provoked. Her relationship with Mortimer was held against her more harshly than the crimes of any male favorite, and her political assertiveness was recast as unnatural cruelty. She was vilified not because her actions were uniquely ruthless. Kings had deposed rivals and executed enemies for centuries, but because she was a woman who dared to transgress the bounds of wifely obedience. To understand Isabella only as a she-wolf, however, is to flatten her into a caricature. She was also a mother who sought to secure her son's future, a queen who endured neglect and humiliation, and a ruler who, for a brief moment, held the kingdom in her hands. Her scandal was real, but it was inseparable from the structures of power that denied women legitimate authority. By taking what she could, Isabella exposed the contradictions of her world, a society that demanded queens produce heirs and embody loyalty, yet recoiled when they wielded power with the same decisiveness as men. Her story also deepens our understanding of the theme of love, scandal, and secret agendas. Her marriage to Edward was not merely a personal tragedy, but a political disaster, and her relationship with Mortimer was not only an affair, but a rebellion. The entanglement of private life and public consequence was unavoidable for queens, whose bodies, marriages, and emotions were always matters of state. Isabella's choices remind us that the court was never a place of simple affection or loyalty. It was a stage where love could be weaponized, where scandal could reshape dynasties, and where secret agendas could topple kings. Isabella's life also left an enduring shadow. Later generations remembered her with suspicion, casting her as the archetype of the treacherous queen. Plays, poems, and chronicles depicted her as dangerous, a warning about what happens when women overstep their bounds. Yet this legacy itself is part of the pattern of erasure and distortion. By painting her only as a villain, her contemporaries and successors concealed the deeper truth, that her rebellion was not simply personal vengeance, but a calculated intervention in the fate of a kingdom in crisis. Placed in the broader story of English queens, Isabella stands as a figure of audacity. Where Eleanor of Aquitaine used her authority to shape dynasties across Europe, Isabella used hers to unseat a king. Both challenge the notion that queens must remain in the shadows of their husbands. Both reveal how marriage, intended to bind women into obedience, could become a source of leverage when wielded with intelligence and daring. Their lives remind us that queenship was never passive, that behind the silks and ceremonies were women capable of wielding daggers of strategy as sharp as any man's sword. In the end, Isabella of France defies every neat category. She was at once victim and victor, queen and rebel, mother and scandal, consort and conspirator. Her life was marked by humiliation, passion, and ambition, and her choices changed the course of England's monarchy. To dismiss her as merely the she-wolf is to miss the humanity behind the legend. The woman who endured betrayal, grasped at power, and in doing so revealed the fault lines of her world. Her story continues the larger truth we have seen in so many queens, that beneath the appearance of delicacy lay resilience, beneath the expectation of silence lay voices of command, and beneath the veil of loyalty lay the capacity for rebellion. Isabella of France did not only play her part in a tale of scandal. She rewrote the script of queenship itself, proving that love and betrayal, hearts and daggers, were inseparable from the politics of power. And Bullen's story emerges as a continuation of the same current that ran through Isabella of France's life, a reminder that queenship was never simply about silken gowns, airs, and quiet devotion. Where Isabella of France confronted a king's betrayal and turned her grievance into rebellion, and Bullen confronted a king's desire and turned it into revolution. Both women were judged harshly by their contemporaries, branded with monstrous reputations that obscured the full scope of their intelligence and courage. Yet while Isabella's legacy is tied to the overthrow of a husband, Anne's is tied to the creation of an entirely new order, one that changed the spiritual and political fabric of England forever. Her rise and fall sit at the heart of one of the most explosive moments in English history, the break with Rome and the birth of the Church of England. When Anne first arrived at Henry VIII's court, she was not an obvious queen. She was not a foreign princess bearing treaties in her dowry, nor was she the traditional bride who came packaged with dynastic security. She was the daughter of Thomas Bullen, an ambitious courtier with solid but not royal connections, and Elizabeth Howard, whose noble blood was undeniable but hardly sufficient to vault their daughter into the highest circles of power, and had been educated in the Netherlands and France, where she absorbed not only the refinements of courtly manners, but also the intellectual currents of the Renaissance and Reformation. She was witty, cultured, and sharp, qualities that set her apart from many of the more conventional ladies-in-waiting at court. Her first real role was as a lady to Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry's long-standing and dignified first wife. Catherine, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, had borne Henry a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons. Henry's need for a male heir gnawed at him, especially as he aged and as dynastic stability remained uncertain. Into this fragile environment stepped Anne, who caught Henry's attention not simply because of her beauty, but because of her spirit. She refused to become his mistress, a role that many women in her position might have accepted in hopes of advancement or favor. Instead, she held out for marriage, insisting that she would not give herself unless Henry made her queen. That insistence was radical. Queens were usually chosen from among royal houses of Europe, cementing alliances and bringing prestige. For Henry to consider setting aside a Spanish princess in favor of a lady of his own court was unheard of. But Anne's refusal worked in her favor. It transformed her from a passing infatuation into an obsession. Henry pursued her with letters, with promises, with arguments that grew increasingly entangled in his search for theological justification. His attraction became not just a matter of desire, but of dynastic urgency, for he came to believe that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by God because she was his brother's widow. Anne's boldness lay not only in her resistance, but also in her willingness to tie her fate to Henry's defiance of the Pope. When the Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, Henry began to look for other ways to achieve his goal. This is where Anne's influence becomes unmistakable. Her exposure to reformist ideas in France had made her sympathetic to the growing calls for change within the Church. She introduced Henry to texts critical of papal authority, fanned his interest in arguments that supported royal supremacy, and reinforced his conviction that he was answerable to God alone, not to Rome. While Henry himself was no Protestant revolutionary, Anne's role in nudging him toward a break with the Pope cannot be overstated. By the mid-1520s, Anne had become not merely the king's passion, but also the flashpoint for a political and religious crisis. The so-called King's Great Matter, Henry's quest for an annulment, consumed years of negotiations, debates, and frustrations, and bore the brunt of public hostility during this time. She was blamed for luring the king away from his lawful wife, castigated as a seductress, and labeled as a threat to the sacred order of marriage. Catherine's supporters, both in England and abroad, saw Anne as a usurper who undermined not only a queen but also the unity of Christendom. Despite the fury that surrounded her, Anne held her ground. She was not meek, and she was not silent. Reports describe her as sharp-tongued, quick-witted, and unafraid to spar verbally even with the king himself. She cultivated allies among reformist scholars and courtiers, and she used her influence to promote men who would support the cause of religious change. Her ascendancy to queenship was not only the triumph of personal determination, but also the culmination of a broader movement toward royal authority over the Church. In 1533, after years of tension, Henry finally married, and in secret. Soon after, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and recognized Anne as queen. The break with Rome became irreversible. England's monarch had defied the Pope, severed centuries of allegiance to the Catholic Church, and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually shape the entire course of the nation's history. At the center of it all was Anne, the woman who dared to make herself the linchpin of the king's rebellion against papal authority. As queen, Anne's life was both triumphant and precarious. She was crowned with extraordinary ceremony, a visible declaration of her new position and the legitimacy of her marriage. She soon gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, in September of that same year. Though Henry had hoped for a son, Elizabeth would one day prove the most enduring legacy of Anne's tumultuous reign. At the time, however, the lack of a male heir cast a shadow over her position. The promise that she would deliver what Catherine could not remain unfulfilled. Anne's years as queen were marked by both influence and danger. She remained an advocate for reform, continuing to promote scholars and clergymen aligned with religious change. She supported the spread of English Bibles, encouraged the distribution of reformist texts, and used her patronage to advance causes that would have been impossible under Catherine. Yet her assertiveness, which had once captivated Henry, now began to grate on him. Her sharpness, her willingness to challenge him, and her visible frustration over his infidelities made her less pliant than the king desired. Where once her refusal had fueled his obsession, now her insistence on being his equal provoked irritation. By 1536, Anne's position had grown desperate. She had suffered miscarriages, one of which was said to be of a male child, and Henry's patience began to fray. Meanwhile, his eye had turned to Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting whose gentleness and submissiveness provided a striking contrast to Anne's forceful presence. For Henry, whose need for a male heir remained pressing, and now appeared as a failure. Her enemies at court, long resentful of her influence and her role in Catherine's downfall, saw an opportunity to destroy her. The charges brought against, and were as shocking as they were improbable. She was accused of adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Bullen, as well as of plotting the king's death. These accusations were almost certainly fabricated, designed to remove her quickly and thoroughly. Trials were held, verdicts predetermined, and Anne was condemned. Her eloquence in the courtroom, her insistence on her innocence, and her composure in the face of death did nothing to sway the outcome. On the 19th of May in 1536, she was executed by sword within the Tower of London, a tragic and abrupt end to the queen who had defied a pope and reshaped a kingdom. Anne's downfall was brutal, but her impact endured far beyond her death. Her daughter Elizabeth would become one of England's greatest monarchs, embodying many of the same qualities that defined her mother: intelligence, wit, political acumen, and a refusal to submit to expectations. The legacy of Anne's marriage to Henry was the establishment of a church independent of Rome, a transformation that altered not only English religion but also European politics for generations. The scandal of Anne's life was not limited to the lurid accusations at her trial. It lay also in the fact that she had dared to insist on her own worth, to demand marriage where others would have settled for the role of mistress, and to speak and act in ways that unsettled both her husband and her peers. Like Isabella of France before her, she was vilified not solely for what she did, but for what she represented: a woman who refused to accept the limits placed upon her. Her reputation as a schemer, a seductress, and a usurper reflects less about her true character than about the anxieties of a society unsettled by a queen who would not remain silent. In many ways, Anne's tragedy illustrates the precariousness of female power in a patriarchal world. Her intelligence and ambition brought her to the heights of influence, but the same qualities made her vulnerable to suspicion and resentment. She could not win simply by succeeding. She also had to conform to expectations of gentleness and submission, and her failure to do so became ammunition for her enemies. Her story resonates with the theme of hearts and daggers because her greatest weapon, her refusal to yield, was also the dagger that cut her down. Yet to dwell only on her tragic end is to overlook the depth of her achievement, and was no passive consort swept along by a king's will. She was an architect of change, a catalyst for revolution, and a figure whose life reshaped not only a marriage, but an entire kingdom. Her fall may have been ignominious, but her legacy was immense. Elizabeth's reign, the flourishing of the English Renaissance, and the establishment of England as a Protestant power all trace back to the moment Anne Boleyn dared to hold out for a crown and to the day Henry chose her over the authority of Rome. Like Isabella of France, Anne's story is one of scandal intertwined with politics, of private choices that carried public consequences. Both women demonstrate how queenship exposed women to extraordinary risk, how love and desire became battlegrounds for dynasties, and how those who refused silence were often punished with the harshest of judgments. Yet both also show that even in defeat, their actions could reverberate through history, altering the path of nations. And Boleyn was not simply a victim, nor merely a seductress. She was a woman of intelligence, conviction, and courage, who dared to imagine herself as queen, and who forced the mightiest monarch of the age to reshape his realm in order to have her. Her unconventional end was tragic, but it was not the end of her story. Through Elizabeth, through the Reformation of England, through the enduring fascination she commands, and continues to stand as a figure who shattered the expectations of her world, wielding her own heart and dagger in defiance of all that sought to contain her. Caroline of Brunswick's story continues the chain of women like Isabella of France and Anne Boleyn, whose personal lives became entangled with public drama, and whose resistance to submission placed them at the center of scandal, controversy, and historical change. Yet her tale unfolded in a later age, one that prided itself on reason, civility, and progress, making the passions and humiliations of her life all the more glaring. If Isabella embodied the medieval queen who turned against her king in rebellion, and Anne Boleyn represented the Tudor queen whose marriage altered the very structure of church and state, Caroline of Brunswick reflected the raw spectacle of a monarchy increasingly exposed to the public eye in the age of newspapers, satire, and political opinion. Her marriage to George IV was not only a private disaster, but also a national spectacle, one that raised profound questions about loyalty, morality, and the image of the crown. Caroline was born in 1768 into the ducal house of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a German principality with strong ties to the British royal family. Her upbringing was not luxurious in the way of larger courts. Accounts describe her as spirited and sometimes eccentric, unpolished compared to the ideals of refinement expected of future consorts. She was intelligent, outspoken, and unafraid to express herself in ways that clashed with the restrained decorum prized by the British monarchy. These qualities, which might have charmed in another setting, would later become ammunition for her enemies when her life became a matter of political debate. George, Prince of Wales, who would later become George IV, was her cousin. He had been raised in the splendor of the British court, but had managed to build a reputation for extravagance, debt, and personal irresponsibility. By the time his marriage to Caroline was arranged, George was already entangled in scandal. He had secretly and illegally married Maria Fitzherbert, a Roman Catholic widow, whose religion alone made their union invalid under English law. He had also accumulated enormous debts through gambling and lavish living. Parliament was desperate to see him properly settled, and marriage to Caroline seemed to offer the possibility of stabilizing the wayward prince. The match, however, was doomed from the beginning. George had little interest in Caroline before their wedding and was repelled when he met her in person. Accounts suggest that he found her coarse and unappealing, and Caroline in turn found him equally disagreeable, describing him as fat, unattractive, and drunk on their wedding night. Their relationship was marked by mutual disdain almost from the moment it began. Still, duty dictated that they produce an heir, and within a year Caroline gave birth to their only child, Princess Charlotte, in 1796. After Charlotte's birth, the rift between Caroline and George grew into a chasm. George excluded Caroline from his circle, forbade her from involvement in their daughter's upbringing, and embarked on a life filled with mistresses, indulgence, and disregard for his wife. Caroline, in turn, refused to accept quiet exile. She carved out a separate existence, surrounding herself with her own household, friends, and attendants, some of whom would later become central figures in the accusations that engulfed her. The scandal that defined Caroline's life began in earnest in 1806 with the so-called delicate investigation. George accused Caroline of misconduct, particularly of adultery, and demanded a formal inquiry into her behavior. The investigation gathered testimonies from servants and acquaintances, many of whom described her conduct as inappropriate, though no conclusive evidence of adultery was ever found. The commission ultimately declared that while Caroline's behavior had been indiscreet, she was not guilty of the charges against her. The report, though cautious, effectively cleared her of the most damning accusations, but it also ensured that her reputation would forever be clouded by rumor and innuendo. Caroline's defiance in the face of these accusations cemented her image as a woman unwilling to yield. Rather than retreat into obscurity, she openly contested her husband's hostility. She sought visibility, cultivating public sympathy as a wronged wife and mother separated from her daughter. In an age when newspapers and pamphlets were becoming powerful tools of public opinion, Caroline's plight became a subject of fascination. Satirists, cartoonists, and writers portrayed her both as a victim of her husband's cruelty and as a figure of ridicule, but the very fact that she was discussed so openly was itself revolutionary. The private miseries of the royal family had become matters of national discourse, and Caroline stood at the center of it all. The most tragic element of Caroline's life was the fate of her daughter Charlotte, who became the hope of the nation. Charlotte was the only legitimate grandchild of George III, and her position as heir made her beloved by the public. Unlike her parents, she was seen as virtuous and promising, a fresh future for the monarchy. But in 1817, Charlotte died in childbirth at only 21, leaving both Caroline and George bereft of the one bond that had tied them together. For Caroline, Charlotte's death was not only a personal catastrophe, but also a loss of her strongest link to legitimacy and sympathy within the royal family. When George III finally died in 1820, George IV ascended the throne, and Caroline found herself thrust once again into the spotlight. Despite years of estrangement, she insisted on being recognized as queen consort. George, who detested her and had long sought to rid himself of her, resolved to prevent this at any cost. What followed was one of the most sensational episodes in British royal history, the Queen Caroline affair. Caroline returned to England from her travels abroad to stake her claim, and she was met with an outpouring of public support. Crowds cheered her arrival, hailing her as a symbol of resistance against a corrupt and decadent king. For many, Caroline became less a wronged wife and more a political emblem. At a time when calls for reform, accountability, and greater representation were simmering, Caroline's battle with George came to represent the people's struggle against an unfeeling monarchy. The government, acting on George's wishes, introduced the Pains and Penalties Bill in Parliament in 1820, which sought to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve the marriage on grounds of adultery. The trial that followed was unprecedented. Witnesses were brought from abroad to testify to her supposed misconduct during her years of separation, particularly her alleged relationship with an Italian servant named Bartolomeo Pergami. The proceedings were scandalous, filled with lurid details that gripped the public imagination. Yet Caroline, once again, refused to be cowed. She appeared in Parliament, defended her dignity, and inspired massive demonstrations of support across the country. Ultimately, the bill failed to pass, largely because of the public outcry. Caroline's defiance and the people's sympathy ensured that Parliament could not simply erase her claim. The episode humiliated George, who had hoped to dispose of her quietly. Instead, Caroline had turned what might have been her downfall into a dramatic victory, though it came at immense personal cost. Despite her triumph in the trial, Caroline's life after the affair remained unsettled. She was excluded from George's coronation in 1821, denied the right to take her place beside him. In a final humiliation, she was physically barred from entering Westminster Abbey during the ceremony. Only weeks later, she fell ill and died at the age of 53, her last days marked by exhaustion and bitterness. Her funeral was itself a scene of disorder, with clashes between soldiers and mourners who sought to honor her memory. Caroline's story resonates deeply with the theme of hearts and daggers, for her marriage was not only a personal tragedy but also a public battlefield. She refused the silence expected of a wronged wife, and by doing so, she exposed the failings of the monarchy at a time when its moral authority was already under question. Like Isabella and before her, Caroline paid a steep price for her defiance. She was mocked, slandered, and denied the honors of her position. Yet she also demonstrated the power of a queen consort who would not submit, who turned her suffering into a spectacle that challenged the very image of the crown. What makes Caroline's case distinctive is the role of the public. In earlier centuries, the fates of queens like Isabella were largely determined behind palace walls and within courts of power. Caroline, however, lived in an age where the press, the pamphlet, and the cartoon carried as much weight as the whispers of courtiers. Her scandal was played out not just in royal chambers, but also on the streets, in the newspapers, and in the hearts of the people. She became a figure around whom broader grievances about governance, morality, and reform could rally. Her life revealed that queens were no longer confined to the courtly intrigues of past centuries, but were now inseparably tied to the opinions and passions of the public. Caroline of Brunswick was far from perfect. She could be impulsive, undignified, and reckless in her actions. Yet these flaws only humanized her, making her all the more accessible as a symbol of resistance. To her supporters, she was the wronged wife, the victim of a cruel and debauched king. To her detractors, she was a scandalous figure unfit for the throne. But in both interpretations, she shattered the stereotype of the passive, dutiful queen. She refused to vanish quietly into obscurity, and in doing so, she forced an entire nation to confront the disarray within its monarchy. Her life, like those of Isabella and Anne, illustrates that queenship was never confined to crowns and ceremonies. It was fraught with risk, entangled with desire, politics, and scandal, and always vulnerable to the judgment of others. Caroline's battle with George IV was not merely a private divorce, but a public struggle that exposed the vulnerabilities of the monarchy in a new age. She was a queen who carried her daggers in plain sight, not through rebellion or theology, but through sheer refusal to bow before the weight of disgrace. Catherine of Aragon's life represents a turning point where the personal will of a queen became inseparable from the destiny of a kingdom. She entered English history not only as a devoted wife and mother, but as a woman whose refusal to yield in her marriage dispute with Henry VIII triggered one of the greatest upheavals the nation had ever seen. In her insistence on remaining Henry's lawful wife, she set in motion a chain of events that tore England away from the authority of Rome, gave birth to the English Reformation, and forever reshaped both church and crown. The irony is that Catherine herself was a devout Catholic who never wavered in her loyalty to the Pope. Yet by standing her ground, she became the catalyst for a religious revolution that she would not have welcomed, but which nonetheless transformed her adopted country. Her story, therefore, belongs not only to the realm of scandal and heartache, but also to the realm of innovation and influence, for her defiance pushed Henry into decisions that altered the very foundations of English identity. Catherine was born in 1485, the youngest surviving child of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. From her earliest years, she was trained to embody both piety and political purpose. Her parents had united Spain through their marriage, defeated the last Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, and launched overseas voyages that expanded European horizons. Catherine grew up in this atmosphere of religious devotion, political ambition, and dynastic responsibility. As a princess of one of the most powerful houses in Europe, she was destined for a marriage that would strengthen alliances. That destiny led her across the sea to England, where she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, eldest son of Henry VII. Her marriage to Arthur in 1501 began with high hopes but ended swiftly in sorrow. Arthur died only months after the wedding, leaving Catherine widowed at 15. The question of her future immediately became tangled in dynastic politics. Ferdinand and Isabella wished to maintain the Anglo-Spanish alliance, while Henry VII hesitated over Catherine's dowry and the legitimacy of a second union with his younger son Henry, then Duke of York. To resolve these issues, Catherine declared that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, a statement that would echo through her life with profound consequences. On this claim rested the possibility of her marrying Henry without violating biblical prohibitions against marrying a brother's widow. Years passed before the matter was settled, during which Catherine endured financial hardship and uncertainty. In 1509, the balance tipped in her favor. Henry VII died, and the young Henry ascended as Henry VIII. At 18 he married Catherine, who was then 23. Their marriage began with genuine affection. Henry, vigorous and idealistic, seemed a perfect match for Catherine, whose learning, beauty, and piety impressed both court and people. She quickly became popular, admired for her devotion and her ability to embody the virtues expected of a queen. She served not merely as a consort, but also as regent when Henry campaigned abroad, most notably in 1513 when she commanded forces during the Battle of Flodden, where the English defeated the Scots and their King James IV was slain. Catherine sent Henry the bloodied coat of the fallen Scottish king as proof of the triumph, a gesture that showed her resolve and her awareness of her role in the theater of power. Yet beneath the successes of the early years lay the issue that would define Catherine's marriage: the struggle to produce a surviving male heir. She gave birth to several children, but most died in infancy. Only one daughter, Mary, survived. In an age when dynastic stability depended on a secure male succession, this became a source of mounting tension. Henry's desire for a son grew desperate, and with it his impatience with Catherine. By the late 1520s, his eye had turned to Anne Boleyn, a younger woman whose refusal to become his mistress spurred him to seek annulment of his marriage to Catherine. The legal and theological debate that followed was no mere private quarrel. Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine had always been invalid because she had been his brother's widow, citing biblical passages warning against such unions. Catherine, however, stood firm on her earlier testimony. Her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and thus her marriage to Henry was lawful in both church and conscience. She refused to submit to Henry's wishes or to accept any suggestion that her daughter Mary was illegitimate. For Catherine, this was not simply about personal pride but about her honor, her faith, and her duty as queen. When the case was brought before papal authorities, the situation grew more complicated. The Pope, Clement VII, faced immense pressure. On one hand, Henry demanded annulment, but on the other, Catherine was the aunt of Charles V, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor, whose armies had recently sacked Rome. The Pope could not afford to alienate Charles, and so he delayed and vacillated. This indecision only deepened Henry's frustration and hardened his resolve. Catherine's refusal to acquiesce forced Henry into a position where he chose confrontation over submission. Unable to secure papal approval, he began to seek a path that would free him from Rome's authority altogether. By the early 1530s, this determination culminated in the English Reformation. Henry declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, severed ties with the Pope, and claimed the power to annul his own marriage. In doing so, he not only rid himself of Catherine, but also reshaped the religious and political fabric of his realm. Monasteries were dissolved, church lands confiscated, and loyalty to the crown demanded in matters of faith. What began as a marital dispute became a national revolution. Catherine did not live to see the full consequences of these actions, but her role as the spark cannot be overstated. Her quiet but unyielding resistance forced Henry into a choice that redefined monarchy itself. She became a symbol of steadfastness, standing against the tide of humiliation and intimidation. Even when removed from court, separated from her daughter, and treated as a dowager rather than a queen, Catherine never wavered in her claim to be Henry's lawful wife. She lived her final years in relative isolation, dying in 1536, still steadfast in her conviction. Her last letter to Henry, written on her deathbed, expressed both forgiveness and loyalty, a testament to her enduring faith and dignity. The broader impact of Catherine's defiance lies in the paradox it created. She sought to preserve the sanctity of her marriage and the authority of the Catholic Church, yet her stand precipitated England's break with Rome. She opposed innovation, yet she became its unwitting instrument. Through her refusal, she influenced the course of English history more profoundly than many who actively sought reform. The Reformation that followed would fracture communities, inspire rebellion, and provoke waves of persecution and martyrdom, yet it also forged a distinct English identity tied to the crown rather than the Pope. Catherine's personal sorrow thus became the nation's transformation. Her influence also lived on through her daughter Mary, who, upon becoming queen decades later, sought to restore Catholicism in England. Mary's devotion to her mother's faith and her determination to vindicate Catherine's memory were central to her reign. Yet the tide of history had already shifted. The reforms set in motion during Henry's reign could not be entirely undone. Even as Mary attempted to reassert Rome's authority, her half-sister Elizabeth would later embrace the Protestant settlement that endured for centuries. The roots of that settlement lay in Catherine's steadfastness, which drove Henry to choose separation rather than concession. Catherine of Aragon's story fits seamlessly into the pattern of queens whose lives shaped history beyond the crown they wore. Like Eleanor of Aquitaine, who wielded political influence across Europe, and Elizabeth I, who mastered the art of sovereignty, Catherine altered the trajectory of her nation not by seeking power, but by resisting submission. Her innovation was not deliberate invention, but unshakable constancy. By refusing to bend, she forced change upon those around her. The lessons of her life resonate far beyond the 16th century. They reveal how individual conviction, even when rooted in tradition, can provoke radical transformation. They also illustrate the tension between personal faith and political necessity, a tension that still echoes in the struggles of leadership today. Catherine's refusal to compromise her principles reminds us that influence can arise not only from bold action, but also from quiet endurance. If one views the English Reformation only through the lens of Henry and his ministers, Catherine might appear a passive figure, the obstacle to be removed. But if one examines it through the deeper perspective of cause and effect, she emerges as a central figure without whom the drama could not have unfolded. She did not raise armies or pen manifestos, but she held fast to a claim that forced others to make choices with seismic consequences. Her story, therefore, is not simply one of marital tragedy, but one of historical innovation, where the steadfastness of a queen became the turning point of a nation. Her legacy is visible not only in religious history, but also in cultural memory. To the English people of her time, she became a figure of sympathy and admiration, remembered for her dignity and her devotion to her faith. Even those who supported Henry's reforms could not entirely erase the respect she commanded. In art, literature, and later popular imagination, she has often been cast as the wronged wife, the virtuous queen betrayed by a faithless husband. This image, though romanticized, reflects the enduring impression she made. In reflecting on Catherine's role, it is important to recognize that innovation in history often arises from unintended consequences. She did not seek to create a new church or to alter the balance of power between crown and pope. Yet by standing firm in defense of her marriage, she left Henry no alternative but to forge a new path. The English Reformation might have taken a different shape or timing without her defiance, but it is difficult to imagine it occurring in the same way. Catherine thus remains one of those figures whose personal decisions carried national and even global weight, shaping the faith and politics of millions who came after her. In the grand arc of English queenship, Catherine of Aragon illustrates how influence can be exerted not through conquest, scandal, or cunning, but through principle. Her life, marked by sorrow, endurance, and faith, shattered the stereotype of queens as merely ornamental. She was neither demure nor submissive when confronted with injustice. She was instead a woman who believed in the sanctity of her vows and who refused to compromise her honor. In doing so, she changed the destiny of England, leaving a legacy that endures to this day. Henrietta Maria of France represents one of the most controversial figures in English royal history, for her presence at court and her influence on Charles I became entangled with the political and religious tensions that would erupt into the English Civil War. Like Catherine of Aragon before her, she entered England as a Catholic queen consort in a deeply Protestant kingdom, but unlike Catherine, she did not attempt to hide her faith or conform outwardly to English religious expectations. Her story is bound to the growing rift between monarchy and parliament, between Catholic sympathies and Protestant fears, and between personal devotion and political necessity. By standing openly as a Catholic at a time when anti-Catholic sentiment defined much of English political identity, Henrietta Maria became both a symbol and a scapegoat, shaping events not only through her marriage, but through the mistrust and suspicion she generated. Her role illustrates how queens could profoundly influence the course of history, even when they did not sit on the throne in their own right. Henrietta Maria was born in 1509 to Henry IV of France and his second wife, Marie de Medici. As the youngest daughter of a French king, she grew up in a household marked by the turbulence of post-Reformation Europe, where religious divisions defined politics. France itself had endured brutal wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, and Henrietta Maria's family played a central role in the fragile peace that followed. Her upbringing was steeped in Catholic devotion, and like many daughters of royal houses, she was raised with the expectation that her marriage would serve the strategic interests of her dynasty. Her union with Charles I of England was arranged to cement an alliance between England and France, binding two monarchies with a history of rivalry and mistrust. When she married Charles in 1625, she entered a country where hostility toward Catholicism was not only cultural but deeply political. Memories of Mary Tudor's bloody attempts to restore Catholicism in the previous century lingered, and the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 remained vivid in the English imagination. Anti-Catholic sentiment was embedded in law and rhetoric, with Parliament often pushing for harsher restrictions on Catholic worship and participation in public life. Into this atmosphere stepped a young, foreign-born queen who not only practiced Catholicism but refused to mask her faith. She brought with her a household of French attendants, many of whom were Catholic priests and advisors, and she insisted on maintaining her own chapel at court. To the Protestant majority, this was alarming and provocative. Charles himself was deeply attached to Henrietta Maria, though their marriage began with strains. At first, she resented being separated from her French attendants when Charles dismissed many of them under pressure from Parliament. But over time, the couple grew genuinely close, and Charles came to depend heavily on her counsel and companionship. This intimacy became another source of suspicion, for critics believed the king was unduly influenced by his Catholic wife, whose advice was said to steer him away from compromise with Parliament and toward authoritarian policies. Whether or not her influence was decisive, the perception that she whispered in his ear at critical moments fueled public mistrust. The years of Charles's reign were already fraught with tension over money, religion, and the limits of royal authority. His efforts to rule without Parliament for long stretches, his enforcement of religious conformity under Archbishop Laud, and his unpopular methods of raising revenue all bred resentment. Henrietta Maria's visible Catholicism seemed to confirm the worst fears of his opponents. To many Puritans and parliamentarians, she represented the danger of popery at the heart of the English monarchy. Pamphlets and propaganda frequently portrayed her as a manipulative schemer, likening her to Jezebel or to the notorious Catholic queens of the past. These depictions were exaggerated, but they reveal how central she was to the political imagination of the time. Her role became even more contentious when the kingdom faced rebellion in Scotland in the late 1630s and early 1640s. The Scottish Covenanters resisted Charles's attempts to impose the English prayer book, sparking the bishops' wars. To many observers, Henrietta Maria's Catholicism made it easier to portray these conflicts as part of a broader struggle against tyranny and papist influence. By the time civil war erupted in 1642, she was widely distrusted by parliamentarians, who saw her as a dangerous force behind the king's policies. Henrietta Maria did not remain a passive figure during the conflict. She actively sought foreign support for her husband's cause, traveling abroad to secure aid and raise funds. In 1643, she returned to England with arms and supplies, braving storms and danger to land in Yorkshire and rejoin Charles. For a time, she stayed in the royalist strongholds of the North and Midlands, rallying support and using her presence to inspire loyalty among the king's followers. Her determination was striking, for she placed herself in peril to bolster her husband's cause. She was not merely a symbol but a participant in the struggle, though her activities further fueled parliamentarian propaganda, which accused her of inviting foreign Catholic armies to invade Protestant England. The image of Henrietta Maria as a foreign Catholic queen meddling in English affairs became a powerful tool for her husband's enemies. Parliamentarian writers accused her of corrupting the king's judgment, of conspiring with Rome, and of undermining the Protestant religion. Whether or not these charges had substance, they illustrate how much the perception of a queen could influence the legitimacy of a king. Charles's cause was weakened not only by his political missteps, but by the widespread suspicion that his household, dominated by a Catholic consort, posed a threat to England's identity. As the war turned against the Royalists, Henrietta Maria's position grew precarious. In 1644 she fled to France, where she lived in exile for many years. From abroad she continued to support Charles, lobbying European powers for aid and offering guidance through correspondence. But she could not alter the tide of events. In 1649 Charles was tried and executed, an unprecedented act that shocked Europe. For many of his opponents, the execution was justified not only by his defiance of Parliament, but also by the belief that he had been corrupted and misled by Catholic influence, with Henrietta Maria often cited as the embodiment of that influence. Her later years were marked by sorrow and resilience. Widowed and in exile, she devoted herself to her children, some of whom, like Charles II and James II, would later rule England. Her Catholic faith continued to shape her legacy, for her son James's open Catholicism would eventually provoke the Glorious Revolution of 1688, another upheaval with roots traceable to the fears embodied in Henrietta Maria. She died in 1669, having lived long enough to see the monarchy restored under her son Charles II, though she remained a controversial figure in English memory. The influence of Henrietta Maria is best understood not only in her personal actions, but in the symbolic role she played in a nation on the brink of transformation. She was a queen whose identity clashed with the religious and political anxieties of her time. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who resisted Henry VIII's demands from a position of moral defiance, Henrietta Maria became influential because she embodied the fears of her husband's subjects. She did not seek to provoke civil war, but her faith and her closeness to Charles contributed to the perception that the monarchy itself was at odds with the nation's Protestant identity. Her story also highlights how queens could serve as lightning rods for public discontent. While kings were judged for their policies, queens were often judged for their identities, foreign, female, Catholic, and these identities could be weaponized by political opponents. Henrietta Maria's presence made it easier for parliamentarians to rally support against the crown, casting the struggle not only as a defense of liberty, but as a defense of religion against papist corruption. In this sense, she helped shape the ideological framing of the English Civil War, even if she did not intend to. The consequences of her life stretched far beyond her own era. The Civil War shattered the old bonds between king and people, leading to the temporary abolition of monarchy and the rise of parliamentary power. The suspicion of Catholicism, sharpened during her lifetime, would linger for generations, influencing everything from the exclusion crisis of the late 17th century to the Glorious Revolution. Henrietta Maria's memory, tied to these suspicions, became part of the cautionary tale about foreign Catholic queens, a narrative that shaped English attitudes toward monarchy itself. In reflecting on Henrietta Maria's role, it becomes clear that influence does not always come through deliberate innovation or conscious reform. Sometimes it comes through the symbolic weight of identity, through the fears and hopes a person embodies in the imagination of a people. Henrietta Maria did not set out to revolutionize England, but by living openly as a Catholic queen in a Protestant nation, by advising and supporting her husband with determination, and by actively seeking aid for his cause, she became a central figure in one of the most transformative conflicts in English history. Her life demonstrates how the presence of a queen could tip the balance of political struggles, making her not merely a consort, but a participant in the fate of a kingdom. Victoria, though often remembered as a symbol of respectability, domesticity, and imperial grandeur, was far more than a figurehead sitting at the apex of 19th-century Britain. Her reign, which lasted more than 60 years, was the longest in English history until surpassed by Elizabeth II in the 21st century. It stretched from the late 1830s to the very beginning of the 20th century, an age that saw immense industrial, political, social, and cultural transformation. The era now bears her name not simply because she occupied the throne during it, but because her image and personal choices came to define its character. She shaped the monarchy into an institution that survived the political upheavals of the 19th century, and in doing so, she forged a model of kingship and queenship that continues to influence the British crown today. When Victoria ascended to the throne in 1837, she was only 18 years old. The monarchy she inherited was fragile, having been tarnished by the scandals of her uncles George IV and William IV. The crown was viewed with suspicion by many, seen as extravagant, morally dubious, and increasingly irrelevant in a society that was shifting power toward Parliament. The Reform Act of 1832 had already expanded the electorate, weakening royal influence in politics, and further reforms were expected. In this environment, the monarchy could easily have faded into ceremonial insignificance or collapsed under public mistrust. Victoria's task, though she may not have fully grasped it at the time, was to restore dignity, stability, and relevance to an institution whose future was uncertain. Her early years as queen revealed both her vulnerabilities and her determination. She relied heavily on Lord Melbourne, her first prime minister, who guided her in political matters and provided the paternal support she had lacked during a strict and often isolated childhood. Their relationship drew criticism, particularly from the Tory opposition, who accused Melbourne of exploiting the young queen. But the bond also gave Victoria the confidence to assert herself as monarch. She insisted on her right to choose her own household staff, resisted attempts to control her by her domineering mother, and demonstrated a clear sense of her authority. These early struggles helped shape her into a monarch who valued independence and who understood the importance of personal image in maintaining public support. Her marriage to Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha in 1840 marked a turning point in her reign. Although she was initially resistant to marriage, fearing it might compromise her independence, she quickly came to depend on Albert as a partner both in her personal life and in the management of the monarchy. Albert was intelligent, ambitious, and reform-minded. He encouraged the Queen to embrace a vision of monarchy grounded in moral respectability, domestic virtue, and public service. Together they cultivated an image of the royal family as the embodiment of middle-class values, stable marriage, devotion to children, and seriousness of purpose. At a time when industrialization and social change were unsettling traditional hierarchies, this image resonated powerfully with the public. Victoria's role as wife and mother became central to her identity, both personally and publicly. She bore 9 children, and portraits of her with Albert and their offspring were widely circulated, presenting the royal family as a model of domestic life. Yet this idealized picture belied the complexity of her reality. In private, Victoria often struggled with motherhood, expressing frustration with pregnancy and the demands of child-rearing. She was passionate, quick-tempered, and sometimes distant from her children. Still, the public image of the Queen as the maternal figure of the nation took root, reinforcing the idea that monarchy could serve as a moral compass in an age of rapid change. Albert's influence extended beyond domestic imagery. He played a key role in shaping the monarchy's engagement with science, industry, and culture. His involvement in the Great Exhibition of 1851, a showcase of technological innovation and imperial power held in London's Crystal Palace, highlighted how the crown could align itself with progress and national pride. The event drew millions of visitors and cemented the link between the monarchy and Britain's industrial and imperial achievements. For Victoria, Albert's vision offered a way to secure the monarchy's relevance in a society increasingly driven by commerce and innovation. The death of Albert in 1861 devastated Victoria and changed the course of her reign. She went into deep mourning, retreating from public life for years and wearing black for the rest of her life. Her withdrawal provoked criticism, for many saw her absence as a neglect of her duties. Republican sentiment briefly grew, with newspapers questioning the need for a monarch who was rarely seen. Yet even in grief, Victoria reshaped the monarchy. Her mourning, though excessive to some, resonated with a culture that valued sentiment and domestic devotion. She became the Widow of Windsor, embodying both personal loss and the nation's sense of moral seriousness. Over time, her grief itself became part of her public identity, reinforcing the image of monarchy as rooted in human emotion and shared experience. Despite her seclusion, Victoria maintained political influence. She corresponded regularly with her ministers, often pressing her views strongly. She opposed certain reforms, resisted moves toward Irish Home Rule, and clashed with politicians she disliked, such as William Gladstone. She favored conservative figures like Benjamin Disraeli, who flattered her and emphasized the monarchy's role in the empire. Disraeli's gift of the title Empress of India in 1876 reflected both her pride in the empire and her willingness to embrace symbolic gestures that reinforced royal prestige. This title not only bolstered her authority, but also tied her image more directly to the expansion of British power overseas. Her reign was marked by the paradox of a queen presiding over a constitutional monarchy that steadily lost political power. Parliament, not the crown, drove legislation, and prime ministers wielded real authority. Yet Victoria's personal presence remained central to national identity. Through ceremonies, jubilees, and her sheer longevity, she came to symbolize continuity in a century of upheaval. The Golden Jubilee of 1887 and the Diamond Jubilee of 1897 were not merely celebrations of her personal milestones, but affirmations of the monarchy itself as an enduring institution. Millions across the empire participated, reinforcing the connection between queen, nation, and empire. Victoria's personal influence extended to her children, whose marriages created a vast network of dynastic ties across Europe. She was called the Grandmother of Europe, for her descendants sat on many thrones, including those of Germany, Russia, and Spain. These alliances reflected both her dynastic ambition and her belief in family as a tool of diplomacy. Yet they also contributed to the tensions that would later erupt in the First World War, when her grandchildren found themselves on opposing sides of the conflict. This unintended consequence highlights how the personal and the political were deeply intertwined in her reign. Culturally, Victoria's reign oversaw profound shifts. The Victorian age became associated with moral restraint, rigid social codes, and strict gender roles, yet it was also an era of reform and questioning. Literature, science, and philosophy flourished, challenging traditional assumptions. Figures like Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, and John Stuart Mill reshaped public debate. The monarchy could have been marginalized in such a climate, but Victoria's symbolic role as a steady figure helped anchor national identity amidst the ferment. Even when she was absent from public life, her image was omnipresent, appearing in portraits, statues, coins, and popular culture. One of her greatest contributions to the monarchy was her success in redefining its relationship with the people. Instead of relying on direct political power, she demonstrated that the crown could endure by cultivating moral authority, personal symbolism, and emotional resonance. This transformation allowed the monarchy to survive the expansion of democracy, industrial capitalism, and empire. By the time of her death in 1901, the monarchy had shifted from a precarious institution tainted by scandal to a central pillar of British identity. Her funeral and the outpouring of grief that followed confirmed how deeply she had shaped the nation. Millions mourned her not simply as a queen, but as a grandmotherly figure who had presided over their lives for decades. Her passing marked the end of an era, yet the monarchy she left behind was stronger and more secure than the one she inherited. Her example demonstrated how a queen could influence not through commanding armies or directing governments, but through the careful cultivation of image, family, and continuity. Victoria's reign also carried contradictions. She was a female monarch who ruled during a time when women were denied the vote and limited in public life. She personally opposed the early women's rights movement, dismissing feminism as madness, even as her own authority challenged assumptions about women's capacities. This paradox reflected both the limits and the possibilities of her influence. Her example offered a model of female power, but one framed within traditional roles of wifehood and motherhood. In this sense, she embodied the tensions of her age, simultaneously conservative and transformative. Her story connects with those queens who came before her. Catherine of Aragon resisting annulment, Elizabeth I ruling as the Virgin Queen, Henrietta Maria embodying the fears of a nation divided. Yet Victoria's influence was distinct. She did not need to fight for legitimacy through war or confrontations with Parliament in the same dramatic fashion. Instead, she reshaped monarchy through endurance, symbolism, and the quiet but profound power of personal example. Where earlier queens had been judged for scandal, religion, or defiance, Victoria was judged for embodying respectability, continuity, and empire. Her long reign created a model of monarchy that survived into the 20th and 21st centuries, a model in which the crown is less about ruling than about representing, less about command than about connection. If one steps back to consider her legacy, it becomes clear that her contribution to shaping British identity was as significant as any military conquest or parliamentary reform. She helped the monarchy transition into the modern world, ensuring its survival in a democratic age. She gave the crown a role not in directing government, but in embodying the nation's values and aspirations. And she left behind not only an institution stronger than the one she inherited, but also a cultural era defined by her presence. Her reign demonstrates that influence can be exercised in subtle ways. By living long, by mourning deeply, by presenting herself as wife, mother, widow, and empress, Victoria connected with her people in ways that transcended politics. She showed that the crown could thrive not by wielding power directly, but by shaping identity, culture, and imagination. This was the quiet revolution of her reign, the reinvention of monarchy as a moral and symbolic force in modern society. Across the centuries, queens of England have been remembered in stories that often strip them down to a single image. The she-wolf, the virgin queen, the tragic wife, the grieving widow. These labels are convenient and dramatic, but they do not reflect the depth of the women who wore crowns and wielded power. In earlier times, chroniclers and historians, usually men, shaped these portrayals to fit their own cultural assumptions about women and authority. Queens were either celebrated for their virtue or condemned for their ambition, rarely given space to be complex human beings. Yet as the world has changed and new voices have joined the discussion, the way we think about these figures has shifted. Today, in the 21st century, their lives and choices speak to us in fresh ways, not simply as relics of the past, but as mirrors for ongoing conversations about power, gender, and leadership. The queens we have traced, from Matilda's defiance on the battlefield to Victoria's shaping of modern monarchy, show how women navigated worlds that were often hostile to them. Their stories remind us that power was never handed to them easily. They had to seize it, negotiate it, or embody it in ways that made it acceptable to those who might otherwise resist. Some did this through open defiance, like Eleanor of Aquitaine marching alongside crusaders, or Elizabeth I declaring she had the heart and stomach of a king. Others worked within private or domestic spaces, like Catherine of Aragon shaping the course of religion through a marriage dispute, or Victoria projecting stability by embodying middle-class values. Each approach carried risks, and each came with consequences. Yet what unites them is the refusal to remain silent or passive in the face of forces that sought to define them narrowly. In our own time, these choices resonate in discussions about how women navigate leadership roles today. When modern women in politics, business, or culture are described as too ambitious, too emotional, too cold, or too dependent, echoes of the same criticisms leveled against queens centuries ago can be heard. And Boleyn was branded manipulative and dangerous for seeking influence over her king, much as contemporary women are sometimes accused of overstepping when they assert authority. Isabella of France was vilified as unnatural and cruel for overthrowing her husband, while men who pursued similar acts of political rebellion were praised as decisive. Even Victoria, who embodied domestic values, was mocked for withdrawing from public life in grief, as though her emotions undermined her role. These parallels show that the struggles of queens are not distant curiosities, but part of an ongoing conversation about how societies view women in power. Reevaluating these women also challenges us to think differently about history itself. Traditional accounts have often reduced queens to supporting characters in the stories of kings. They appear in footnotes, mentioned only as wives or mothers, unless their actions were so dramatic that they could not be ignored. But when we look closer, we see that their influence shaped events in ways just as significant as the deeds of their husbands, brothers, or sons. Henrietta Maria's Catholic faith helped spark tensions that led to civil war. Caroline of Brunswick's battle against George IV stirred public debates about marriage, morality, and women's rights. These were not secondary roles. They were central to the shaping of the nation. The task of modern historians, and indeed of anyone interested in understanding the past, is to restore these women to their rightful place as active agents in history. The process of reevaluation is not just about fairness to the individuals. It is about the kind of stories we tell about power. When we accept the old idea that only men directed the course of events, we miss how societies truly worked. Queens influenced politics not only through crowns and councils, but also through networks, marriages, patronage, and cultural representation. They knew that power is not always about giving orders. It can be about shaping images, framing debates, or inspiring loyalty. In this sense, their lives expand our understanding of leadership itself. Leadership is not one single thing. It can take many forms, and some of the most enduring forms are those that operate through persuasion, symbolism, or quiet resilience. As we revisit their legacies, we also find ourselves asking what it means to be remembered. Elizabeth I deliberately crafted her image as the Virgin Queen, using it as a political weapon to secure independence from marriage and to command respect from foreign powers. Yet behind the image was a woman constantly balancing insecurity, ambition, and the demands of her court. And Boleyn's legacy was shaped by her enemies, who portrayed her as guilty of adultery and witchcraft, even though her true crime was refusing to fit the mold expected of her. For centuries, these portrayals defined how people understood them. Only now, with more inclusive approaches to history, are we beginning to peel back the layers and see the person as well as the symbol. This matters not just for scholars, but for anyone trying to understand the complexity of leadership and identity. By looking closely at queens, we see how public narratives can distort private realities. We see how power is often framed in gendered terms, rewarding men for traits that are condemned in women. And we see how myths can endure for generations, shaping how people remember figures long after their deaths. In recognizing these patterns, we also become better equipped to question the narratives of our own time. When leaders today are celebrated or criticized, are we seeing the whole person, or are we falling back on easy labels and stereotypes? The lives of queens encourage us to ask harder questions and resist the temptation of simple answers. Another lesson these women offer is that influence does not always require holding the highest office or commanding armies. Many of the queens we have considered did not rule outright, but they still left marks on history that endure. Catherine of Aragon did not control the government, but by refusing to accept an annulment, she helped set in motion the English Reformation, a turning point in world history. Caroline of Brunswick did not reform the monarchy through legislation, but her defiance in the face of humiliation forced a public conversation about the power dynamics within marriage and monarchy. Victoria did not pass laws, but her presence helped define what the monarchy became in a democratic age. These examples remind us that leadership and impact can be found in many forms, often outside the conventional structures of authority. The ongoing relevance of these queens also shows why diverse perspectives are essential in history. When history is told only through the voices of kings, generals, and male politicians, the story is incomplete. By including queens and other marginalized figures, we gain a fuller, more honest view of the past. This diversity of perspective allows us to see not only the achievements of powerful individuals, but also the struggles of those who lived within systems that sought to confine them. It helps us understand how societies balanced ideals of order and morality with the realities of ambition and desire. And it reminds us that history is not fixed. It is constantly being reinterpreted as new voices bring fresh insights. This reinterpretation is especially important in a century where the role of women in leadership remains a pressing question. Around the world, women continue to fight for equal representation in politics, business, and other spheres of influence. The stories of queens demonstrate that these struggles are not new. They have deep roots in the past, where women pushed against barriers and created spaces for themselves, even in the most rigid systems. Their successes and failures alike provide valuable lessons for how progress is made, how power is contested, and how resilience can reshape institutions. Victoria's long reign, Elizabeth's strategic independence, Eleanor's political acumen and tragic fall, and Isabella's daring rebellion all speak to the range of possibilities that existed for women, even in eras that sought to limit them. By revisiting their lives, we are reminded that gender did not define capability. It only defined the obstacles placed in their way. Their ability to act, to influence, and to endure in spite of these obstacles is what makes their stories resonate so strongly now. The call, then, is to look beyond the superficial. It is tempting to see history as a pageant of costumes, jewels, and palaces, where queens appear only in ball gowns and portraits. But these trappings tell only part of the story. Beneath the crowns were human beings wrestling with the same challenges of ambition, identity, and purpose that people face today. They were not simply symbols of beauty or scandal. They were leaders, innovators, rebels, and survivors. To appreciate them fully, we must move past the simple labels and engage with the messy, complicated realities of their lives. In doing so, we not only honor their legacies, but also enrich our understanding of history itself. A history that includes the full range of experiences, from the battlefield to the bedchamber, from the council chamber to the nursery, is a history that speaks more truthfully to the human condition. It shows us that power takes many forms, that leadership is not confined to one gender, and that the past is filled with voices worth hearing if only we take the time to listen. The Queens of England remind us that history is not simply about kings, wars, and treaties. It is also about the individuals who challenged expectations, reshaped institutions, and left legacies that continue to echo into the present. Their stories ask us to reconsider how we define power, how we judge leadership, and how we remember those who came before. In the end, the lesson is clear. To truly understand history, we must look beyond the surface, beyond the ball gown, and embrace the full complexity of the women who stood at the heart of it.